A 1-minute warning. Well, folks here are getting coffee, still coming in, and that's good, getting settled, dealing with the traffic. If you need it over here, we've got Bibles, we got pens, we got paper, any of those kind of things. And as you're getting settled, we're gonna backtrack just a little bit. We're gonna start at the beginning of chapter 3 of Colossians. So if you got your Bible, you want to be looking at that part. And if you got the NT Wright book, we are on page 173. Even though we're having a little bit of a later start today, I'll also say we're going to have a little bit of an earlier finish because we have a funeral today at 11. So I need to be able to switch gears. I don't know if y'all remember April Harrison, who was a parishioner here. She died almost a year and a half ago, but given COVID and everything else like that, the family was traveling from all over to get here. Really wanted to wait until we set this day on the calendar. So we'll need to end a little bit before 10:30. No, do that. She would teach yoga here. That's right. Yeah. So keep her and her family in your prayers today. All right, a few folks who are online wouldn't mind muting yourselves. I'm getting a little bit of feedback through the computers there. And if you have something you want to raise your hand, and I will do my best to keep looking at y'all. And I'll also do my best if there's a question from the group to be able to repeat it online so that you all can hear that as we get through the technical difficulties with as little difficulty as we can. I will say, I think I heard someone say, what's next? Well, this is the second to last class for Colossians. We'll finish up next week with Colossians, and after that, Doug Bischoff is going to be teaching the parables at 10 o'clock to both men and women. In years past, he's done a men's class, and then after that, a women's class. This year, he's just going to do one class for everybody at 10 o'clock on Thursdays. So we're switching from 9:30 to 10, and that'll start July the 15th.
Is there a book? Bible.
The Bible is the book.
But I mean, is there a supplemental book?
There is not a supplemental book that I know of. No, he's just going to be talking about him. He's read a lot of different things and brings that into interpretation.
Okay.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious Lord, Heavenly Father, in you we live and move and have our being. And in you we live. May we put on your Son, Jesus Christ, this day and always, not only keeping our minds on things heavenly, but also remembering that our feet are on this earth, and that even as we yearn for home, we have ways to live here, and may those ways always be guided by your peace and your love. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to get complicated today. And it's not, what we're talking about, first of all, is not easy. Second of all, it's not easy to understand. And one of the things that I like about the Episcopal Church and other denominations too, when it comes to reading the Bible, is we're really not proof texters. Proof texting is to take one passage and basically try to make that carry all kinds of weight. We're trying to prove that slavery is legitimate. So we go to the Bible, we find the passages that can prove our point, neglecting the other passages that might be on the other side of that. So we're trying to prove something. So the reverse of that is when we hear something in Scripture that sounds unprovable or not in alignment with our understanding of things now. So take the story of creation, Genesis. On the first day, on the second day, whatever. And our sense of days are different, and we're able.
We lost him.
As much. And the sense of day being 24 hours isn't the main point. The main point is that God created. So the same thing today when we get into this, what's called a household code. Husbands, this is how you ought to behave. Wives, this is how you behave. Slaves, this is how you behave. If we go to proof texting about that, if we don't open our minds a little bit to understanding what Paul is trying to say in terms of human relationships, then I think we get bogged down. We don't like what he says. We just want to throw it all out. And then we miss what Paul is able to share with us in all of that. So one of the contexts of this chapter is Paul reminding us to think of things that are above. Put your mind on things that are above, not on the sexual things, some of which we went over last week, or bad sexual things, or bad kind of speech things. Those are more earthly, grounded things. We don't want to think about those. We want to think about things that are above. And that's when he tells us to put on Christ. But just as I sort of suggested in my prayer, even though our mind is set on things heavenly, we can't forget that we are still here on the earth. And we have some human relationships, household relationships, that actually may need to be reimagined given who we are in Christ, but not completely jettisoned. N.T. Wright begins to use some of that language when he talks at one point, pretend that all of a sudden there were no laws left in this country. None whatsoever. You were completely free. And his point was to drive on whatever side of the road you wanted to drive on, to do, all these other kind of things. Some are law, some are custom, and people just doing whatever. Well, taken to an extreme, the freedom we have in Christ. We have been enslaved, and now we are free. If taken that freedom to an extreme, what if we think all bets are off? All slaves can be free. All wives can do what they want. All husbands can do what they want. There's really no code. And part of what Paul is saying in this letter is, even as we think of things that are above, we still have some things in the ways we behave. So let's think about how those are. But actually, in many contexts, he's reimagining those. He is not reimagining as we are doing now in terms of slavery, even though there is slavery in the world. Our point would say, well, slavery is wrong. We shouldn't be doing slavery. That, for whatever reason, is not what's on his radar, to say we shouldn't have slavery. But what he's saying is, since there is slavery, this is how you ought to act in this social construct. And I was showing something to Bill, and I'm happy to show you anybody this understanding of a household code that was existing in Paul's time that had to do with Judaism, and had to do with Greeks or Hellenistic culture. What is the code of the household? And clearly it was hierarchical with the man at the head. But in a sense then, over the man, there was nobody. Now part of what Paul is saying, and we're going to get into that, is actually there is somebody over the man, and that's Jesus. Slave owners, there's nobody over. I can make all the demands. No, actually, you are a slave to Christ. So everything is reoriented now based on a relationship with Christ. I'm not trying to gloss over what we read in these things, but I think N.T. Wright does a fairly decent job explaining it and trying to put it in the context that we can understand, of a context that it actually was what was happening in this time in this world. So I really want you to think about these two things: the heaven and earth difference. Keep your mind on things that are in heaven, even as you're living on the earth, and the sense of putting on Christ. Because I really think it's fair to assess what we're going to get to at the end of chapter 3 with wives and slaves and husbands and masters, as those positions are also putting on Christ. And there's a new layer of clothing for them to understand in those relationships. In particular, so that we don't disturb the status quo culturally. And I want to give you an example of that. If you were here yesterday for Garrett Jones's talk about what his missionary life in China was like, or is like, because he's there. One of the things he is saying is he's in China. He knows it's pretty illegal for him to be there. And he has got to go with the flow. He can't just go over there and try to pretend like he's an American or pretend like none of that matters. If he does that, he's going to get kicked out. What the outsiders think of him and Christians is important. And we're going to get to that in chapter 4 of Colossians. The outsiders looking in, Paul wants them to see a loving, kind community where people have strong, appropriate sexual relationships. They're not angry and then going off the top of their head. They're treating their slaves in, hey, he's really being kind to this slave. And the slave is really doing it not because he has to, but because he wants to. And the wives, and look at that community. I might actually want to be part of that. And that's the same type of thing that Garrett Jones is doing in China. By having these relationships, running a business in a certain way, running a household in a certain way is actually a form of evangelism. So if we're mindful of what outsiders are thinking, not superficially so, but actually so, that is a way that people are curious, that they're drawn in, and that they wonder. So think about what we're reading in the terms of sort of this larger, much larger picture of what's going on and how Paul is trying to get them to understand. And this is what we describe it in the already, not yet. Already we've been saved, but not yet have we gone to heaven. So in this already, not yet world, we do have to live a certain way in this world. Moses was concerned about a household covenant. Honor your mother and your father. The 10 Commandments, do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal, do not covet. Covet's coming up in here too today. The 10th commandment, which is sort of that coverall. So that's sort of my introductory remarks as we get into some of the nitty gritty that we have today in talking about Colossians. And I'll stop to see if you have any questions. Any questions from the room? All right. Any questions from online, folks?
I don't have a question, but I would ask that the online folks please mute, because every time they move, I can only see them and not you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. And I think you can, if they're online, you can select what view you have too, the speaker view or and that may be what she's referring to, where it's just bouncing back and forth. All right. So in the N.T. Wright book on page 173, and if you're just looking at your Bible, it's Colossians chapter 3. And remember, part of what he's talking about is you were dead to sin, you were buried with Christ, and then you're made alive. This is the new life we're living into. So if you are raised to life with the King, search for the things that are above, where the King is seated at God's right hand. That's part of our Nicene Creed, that statement, seated at the right hand of the Father. When Stephen, the first martyr of the church, in the Acts of the Apostles, looks up to heaven and he says, oh, look, I see God and Jesus seated at his right hand. This was an understanding of hierarchy in itself, and that being at someone's right hand, it puts you also in that place of superiority. Whether it's literal right hand or whether that figure of speech helps us to understand that is again one of those figures of speech that could be helpful, even as it might be literal. So here we are, what I was saying just a moment ago. Think about the things that are above, not the things that belong to the earth. Don't you see you died and your life has been hidden with the King in God? And when the King is revealed, then you too will be revealed with him in glory. As a reminder, that word hidden, we talked about last week. Howard brought this up, good point. It really much means more like something is secured, put away in a safe, hidden. If you don't want people to steal something, what do? You hide it. This is your hotel room. Okay, I'm going to leave a couple of things here. I'm not going to put it in the drawer. I'm going to put it in the mattress under the and then I just have to remember myself to get it before I leave, and everything else that comes with that. So you're hiding it. So there is security in that. But part of this, and some of your translations may read seek, some may read search. Seek or search for the things that are above. Much like we have in the gospel, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. It's all in there in the New Testament. Set your minds on something. So I'm going to use a golf analogy here with this. Sometimes in golf or other things, you have to have one swing thought. If you try to think of all the things you're supposed to do right in swinging the golf club, your mind can't do all those things. But if you're really concentrating and you're really focusing and you're just trying, I'm going to try to do this one thing, then that gives you a singular focus. So that is the same type of thing that Paul is asking them to do. Set your minds on the things that are above. Have a focus there. As many have said, that is our true, we're aliens in this world. Our true home is in heaven. Our true home is the kingdom of God. So set your minds on things that are there. And in doing that, switching over then, since we covered most of that last week, to page 176 in the book, we're going on to verse 5 of chapter 3. So then you must kill off the parts of you that belong on the earth. Another way to think about that, it's not the language here, is some pruning. Oftentimes Jesus talks about God pruning the tree. And as you know, sometimes you prune something and it actually is able to bear more fruit. I learned that about dahlias this week. If you snip off the top at the right time, instead of having one big bloom that's going to come and grow, it allows more branches to go out and it'll have more blooms. Other trees and bushes and fruit are things that way too. You just produce more. So there's that good sense of killing off the things that are unhelpful. Or maybe you think about that annual trip to the dermatologist and a little bit is burned off from time to time. It's the same type of thing. We want to put to death these unsightly things. And again, as we talked about last week, I'm not going to go into it in depth this week. It has to do with sex and speech, relationships. And again, if you think of this whole chapter, sex in this context is not about marriage. But then later on, you are going to have marital relationships, not sexual, but in the sense of the respect and love that comes with them. In other words, no surprise here, marriage is more than sex. And sex is not a substitute for love. You can read all of those things into what is here. So if you put aside the bad behaviors, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and greed, covetousness might be what your translation says in that passage. And again, that's the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's horse or donkey, or automobile or houseboat or whatever else that you just don't covet. That ends up making you greedy. That ends up putting your focus not on something heavenly, but on something earthly that you want to possess. So that could be sexual, but it also could be any type of thing that is covetousness or greedy. It is because of these things that God's wrath comes to disobedient people. And then he's reminding them, you too used to behave like that. You know, before you learned all this, before you became a Christian, that was what you did. You didn't know any better. That was your custom. But now you must put away the lot of them. And here's the verbal stuff: anger, rage, wickedness, blasphemy, and dirty talk. And it's easy for us to think for a moment of those times we've been angry and said things we wish we hadn't said, or in a rage, and done something, maybe even physically, that we wish we hadn't. Wickedness, that's when you sort of connive behind someone's back. A blasphemy, or just dirty talk that comes out, bad language. In our context, it might be bad sexual language, bad racial language, bad gender-specific language, any of those phobias that are out there, or not the phobias out there, but homophobic type of things is what I'm trying to say. And don't tell lies. Again, this is one of the commandments, do not bear false witness. So all these things are what are happening with the mouth. Those are earthly things. You're living in a different kingdom now. You've stripped off the old, and here is the clothing piece, right? You stripped off the old human nature, complete with its pattern of behavior, and you've put on the new one, which is being renewed in the image of the Creator. And as N.T. Wright says, and as I pointed out last week, being renewed in the image of the Creator is really foundational as N.T. Wright sees it. This is what we're doing. Every time we come to church, have the forgiveness of sins, or go in peace. Let's send us out in the world to give us the work you have to do, to love and to serve you with gladness and singleness of heart. That's a renewing in that image of Christ that we are meant to do. It's not just boom, it happens and we're all good. Doesn't work that way. We have to be renewed often times. So I want to stop there for a second and read his comments on page 178. If you go to that place in the book, and page 179, I asked you to read these, and I think it just really bears repeating. About 10 lines down on page 178, it says, these practices which are abuses rather than proper uses of the two gifts of God. The way to deal with such practices, Paul says, is quite clear. There is to be no gentle, half-hearted approach to such things. No toying with them as continuing possibilities. They are like vermin that mustn't be allowed into the house in case they poison the food or the water supply. They are not to be pitied. They are to be killed off and put to death. The catalog of sexual misbehavior includes both actions and thoughts. Illicit sexual behavior is a wide term, which includes sexual intercourse outside of marriage, whether or not it involves prostitution, as in the ancient world it often might. The other terms are probably not intended each to denote something completely different, but are overlapping ways of referring to sexual lusts of all sorts and its gratification outside the God-given context of marriage. We should know particularly that Paul labels greed, presumably meaning sexual greed, as a form of idolatry. Sexual fantasies, in other words, are off limits for the Christian, not simply because of the actions they may produce, but because they are in themselves a way of worshiping a false god, the pagan divinity of erotic love. Like all pagan worship, this consists of giving one's allegiance to something in the transient world of the present experience, rather than to the living God, the Creator. The inevitable result is death. And he goes on to say, just as he's concerned with sins of speech, he is with sexual sin. Both alike inflict serious damage on the one who commits them, those who are immediately affected by them, and on the wider community. Again, the list in verse 8 consists of overlapping words for angry and hurtful speech. And in verse 9, he highlights one danger in particular, the telling of lies. The Christian gospel is about the truth. And he goes on to say, the point of the new clothes, which the Christian must put on, is that the new life is about unity, about the whole community coming together in love. So part of what's being implied here as he talks about this is how bad sexual practices, bad speech practices not only hurt the individual from the inside out, but begin to hurt the community. And he's trying to build up the community. There's the unity. So it's not just you individually put on Christ. You individually put on Christ is y'all, all y'all. Have that cloak over the whole group that we have. So let me stop there for a second and see if you have any questions or comments. Anybody in the room? Anybody on the screen? All right, very good. So now that we know the clothes we're supposed to take off a little more carefully, here we are on page 180 in the book and verse 12 in the letter of the things we are to put on. These are the clothes you must put on then, since God has chosen you, made you holy, and lavished his love upon you. You must be tender-hearted, kind, humble, meek, and ready to put up with anything. You must bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against someone else, you must forgive each other. Just as the Master forgave you, you must do the same. On top of it all, you must put on love, which ties everything together and makes it complete. Let the King's peace be the deciding factor in your hearts. That's what you were called to within the one body, and be thankful. So you remember, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, those bracelets that kids wearing, WWJD, what would Jesus do? This is Paul's WWJD statement. His statement is really when he says, let the King's peace be the deciding factor in your hearts. When the scales are tipped, you seem to don't know which way to go, or maybe even when you do, make sure you balance that against the peace of Christ. And again, the language to which you are called as one body. And again, one of the major themes of the whole letter, be thankful. If you remember that you've been lavished in love, if you remember that Christ is the center and all things come through him, and you've been brought from death into life through baptism, your main stance is thankfulness. And if you start from that place of thankfulness, I think you're a lot less likely to be greedy and idolatrous. You're a lot less likely to be angry. You're a lot less likely to use sex wrongly, and etc. All the things that Paul is saying. So you can see how this is interwoven as he goes throughout this letter. I wanted to also say that in Ephesians chapter 6, starting at verse 13, Paul uses another clothing image. You've heard it before. Put on the whole armor of Christ. The breastplate of righteousness, the belt of salvation, or the helmet of salvation, all those other type of things. So it was fairly frequent, it seems, that Paul would talk about new clothes and the clothes that we are trying to wear. And it's very applicable for us. We not be wearing the same kind of things that they wore, but we understand changing clothes. We understand putting something new on. Particularly the first time you've gotten out of the shower or whatever else, and you're putting on something new, and it's like, okay, this is new and this is great. Or you're changing out of old clothes into new clothes. We know what that's like. These are dirty, smelly, they're rags. I don't want them anymore. These are nice and clean. Doesn't this feel good? We can all relate to that. And even if we haven't worn armor, we know what it's like for a fireman to put on something, or a policeman or a woman to put on something, or somebody in the Marines, or a scuba diver, any of those other kind of things that we can see where you're putting on something out of the ordinary, but is allowing you, like a scuba diver, to survive in a world that's sometimes hard to survive in. So that's another kind of thing that this clothing is. These are the clothes we need to put on, because sometimes it's hard to survive in this world. And if we're going to survive, these are our survival clothes. That's what armor is. Same kind of thing. So again, tender-hearted, kind, humble, meek, and ready to put up with everything. On page 182 in the book.
Hey, Rob.
Yes. Okay, Bill's got a question. I'm going to remember to repeat it.
Here's the question. I assume that Paul was talking about Jews and Gentiles in this letter, right?
Yes. Bill's assuming that Paul is talking about Jews and Gentiles in the letter. Yes.
And he says that God has chosen you. Well, what did the Jews think of that? Because they were told before that only Jews were the chosen people of God. And here's Paul saying to Gentiles that they've been chosen.
God has chosen you. That's right. How about that? So what Bill is saying is, what do the Jews think about the fact that Paul is saying God has chosen you when he's speaking to Jews and Gentiles a lot? Well, my guess is it had mixed reviews. Some of them got it because they were obviously in this congregation together. Some of them may have been slow in getting it. To use a common analogy, just like it might be slow for some white people in the South to understand some of the racial divisions that have been going on, and we might get it intellectually, but have a harder time with it, or some of the gender things we have a hard time with, or some of the gay and lesbian things we're sort of, we can understand it, but we're coming along to it differently. Interracial marriage, it was outlawed, you couldn't do that. Now it's more prevalent. You have to get used to, so those things you get used to that are the social constructs that Jews and the Greeks had. So it's the same. It's the same. Or even somebody moving from, Miami to Portland are going to have to get used to new cultural things, and they may not like it, but then they may say, hey, this isn't so bad after all to be up here. So that would be my guess. And like anything, interacting with those people that you thought of as other is the best way for us to realize that they're human beings too, and that they're people with feelings and desires and visions and hopes and joys and all those things that come with that. That's my guess to that one. So on page 182 of your book, I'm trying to think about which part I was going to say. First full paragraph. Once again, Paul's list of behavior patterns forms an overlapping sequence, but that doesn't mean in this case that we can just glance at them and think, oh yes, he's just saying we should be nice to each other, though of course we should. Being nice is only the start. It's worth taking a moment and thinking about each word here, asking yourself, or if you're reading this as a group, ask each other, what sort of actions and words will make each one come true in your life, in the life of your church, in the life of your town. So let's think about that for a second. When we think of tender-hearted and kind and humble and meek and ready to put up with anything, let's put some real flesh around those words. What would it mean to be tender-hearted? Or this is what compassion might be. What does it mean to be compassionate?
Well, it means to be able to put yourself in the shoes of other people, no matter who they are.
Putting yourself in the shoes of other people, no matter who they are.
Welcoming a stranger to the church or your organization.
Yeah. Well, compassion, welcoming someone is an act of compassion. Going out of your way, sort of being on the lookout for people who might look like they are uncomfortable or awkward about something. Yeah. Or lonesome. That's right. Taking care of those who are lonely is certainly an act of compassion.
I think of it in the context of political disagreements. What would it be like if someone expressed an opinion that you didn't agree with, and instead of simply arguing back, you stop to try to understand why they had that opinion and whether there was something worthwhile behind that opinion instead of simply that's not what I think and therefore I'm going to oppose it.
Right. Or then in the back of your mind, starting the name calling. Right. Yeah, that's right. So in the political discourse, he was saying, what if we just add a couple of drops of compassion to that and really trying to understand the other person rather than sort of to cast them out of hand. So that's an act of, here's a person, here's an American, here's a member of my church, and they have on their car a bumper sticker of somebody I don't like. And how can I be compassionate with that person? Right. Right. Bill.
Would it have something to do with the word itself? Compassion, starting with C-O-M, having something in common with the other person.
Yes.
In communion with somebody else.
Yes.
In their community.
Yes.
That's
right.
What compassion is. You have a unity with someone else or some other
right.
thing.
Yes. And in that, there's also some giving up of pride in that. Yes. Who's that?
Kate. But to do this also sets you up to be attacked by some of those people, and that and if you, rather than be the one that fights back, or which I have a tendency to do, you need to look for the compassion from them, but you may not find it. And it's difficult to always be the one that's going to be the compassionate one.
Yes, none of these are easy. You're right. Yeah, these are difficult. To truly be compassionate.
We also have to remember that I keep going back to this, the world is a community, and that it's not just the people that are directly around us, but other people think that their way is right too. And who's to say that some of them are not, that they don't reach God through a different channel. And that always worries me, that when we get into we're the one true way, but we just have to not try. I don't know exactly how I'm trying to say this, but we can be compassionate, but sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves. Do you not think so?
I would agree with that, but I think what Paul is saying here, and again, our choice is about our own personal behavior. I can choose to be kind even when someone is not being kind to me. I can be compassionate even when it's someone not being, and if they are not, I hope that by my kindness, that might ratchet down the situation a little bit to get to a new place. And so and again, this is hard work. Therefore, the word passion, which denotes it's this difficult, that it takes energy. This isn't easy. To be humble and meek in our world isn't. But think this is how Christ was on his trial. This is how he was on the cross. All those kind of things, if we're going to be Christ-like, he was compassionate. He was humble. He was meek. He was ready to put up with everything. The crown of thorns, the spitting, the whipping, all those kind of things. So to be Christ-like in this world is sometimes going to mean we are the point of ridicule.
Well, but I'm not so worried about personally being the point of ridicule. But if you are, let's say, the person who is observing the person who is being cruel or being non-compassionate to someone else, at what point then does it become Christ-like to step into it, to stop them? I don't know, because
it may also be how you do it. You don't stop them by beating them over the head with a tennis racket. That's not the compassionate way, but you might put your body between the two. You might end up embracing the other person or going to pick up the other person. You might face the person who's being antagonistic and do again, there are a lot of different ways to do it and how we do it, but these aren't just pleasantries. It is difficult. John.
I think one of the greatest ways to counteract the non-compassionate person is through prayer.
I'll have you repeat that. Bring this a little bit closer so y'all can see John making his statement.
I think that, the greatest way, or one of the greatest ways to show compassion and to help others who are not compassionate, who are angry and whatnot, is through prayer. You pray for that person that they can find the peace of Christ. So prayer, is a big part of how we spread compassion through the world.
And for me, one of the practical applications of that is pretend that you're going to a meeting. It wouldn't be at church, of course, something like an HOA meeting where that person in your neighborhood that's always irritating or annoying or condescending or whatever else is about to be there. And to John's point, before you go to that meeting, you start praying for that person. Before you go to the family reunion with Uncle Tom, and whatever Uncle Tom is going to do, be grouchy, whatever else, you pray for Uncle Tom. And you pray for ways maybe that you can be responsive or be kind. Help me, Lord, just to find this, just to whatever else. And as N.T. Wright says in here, these things don't mean being pushovers. But it does mean recalibrating human relationships on these terms. Which is why then he goes into the next part. But before we get there, I want to read one other section here. We got to the point at the end of verse 15, and be thankful. Verse 16, back on page 180 or in the Bible, let the King's word dwell richly among you as you teach and exhort one another in all wisdom. I like that, teach and exhort one another. Yes, sometimes we look to the teacher, the clergy person who seems to be an expert, a Doug Bischoff, all those kind of people, but we're also teaching each other. They're teaching moments all throughout life. Those people who like to be teachers more than they like to be learners when it comes to, you need to do this or you need to do that. We don't want to be that, but we do want to help people understand. And what can we do in that way? And here's again the thing about worship. We talked about that part of chapter 1 maybe being a hymn. Well, here's a reference to, and in wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with grateful hearts. And be thankful and have a grateful heart and sing and pray. So this is part of what we understand what was happening in the worship community in those ways. And whatever you do in word or action, I love that specificity, not just your words, but your actions. Because as we know, like the cliche says, actions speak louder than words. Whatever you're doing in your actions, whatever you're doing in words, do it in the name of the Master. So he's just about to weave into these household relationships, reminding them who the Master is. Before he does that, giving thanks to him, through him to God the Father. So again, this is a Christ-centered way of living that comes with that. Switching over to page 183 now in your book in Colossians 3:18. As I said at the beginning, think of this in the whole context of this letter, of what putting on Christ is, of what new life is, about recalibrating relationships, not according to the elemental things of this world, but according to the things that are above. So he speaks to wives. You should treat your husbands with respect. Now, one of the questions that comes up with this is, why does he all of a sudden go to this? Is he referring to something as Epaphras or some other person talked about relationships being different. And one of the things I read, whether it's wives or slaves, is where before in a church worship setting, there may have just been men in the room. But now, given the openness of the community, more women are involved. And some slaves are involved. One of the things I read said a third of the world at this point in Italy and Greece was in slavery. Now, it may not be slavery like we understand it in the South from our history, but it may have just been one person, it may have been more, whatever else, but there were slavery in a different context. I'm not at all saying that slavery is right in that sense, but it was one of the social norms. And again, Paul isn't trying to uproot that. He is saying, here it is. Really, he probably thought, it's all going to be over in 5 or 10 years anyway. So why worry about changing it? Just do the best you can in how you are in this situation now. But as women and slaves became part of a room, part of a group, then they're scratching their heads to say, well, what does that mean? Who can say things? Can women say things? Can slaves say things? Can we do things together? And some of the analogy I think of is, and I have experienced it with some parishioners who came here who are actually staff at one of the local clubs. And at the local club, it's always, hey, Miss Alma, hey, Miss Linda, and they're calling you by your Mrs. Stone, your formal name. Well, they come here, and parishioners were saying to them, you don't have to call me that here, just call me Linda, just call me Alma. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't bring themselves to do it because they were so focused on that. And so it's the only thing I think of locally is what could you do if you were in one social setting in one place and another social setting in another place? You're trying to maintain some of those things because it hasn't gone away. It's just now that we're here, we can be more familial. But some people just can't shake it. Or the opposite can be true. They're ready to start calling you Linda and Kay. And you're like, I'm not ready for that. And so part of what Paul is saying is here, the husband and wife situation, the parent-child situation, all those things, those are still intact. We're not trying to turn over the whole culture here, but we're reinterpreting those relationships in light of putting on Christ and living in this way. So even though this doesn't feel like a very 21st century passage in terms of our cultural relationships that we have now, we can glean it from other relationships that we might be in. If we were to go to church all of a sudden and show up there and there's our lawn guy. We would go to church all of a sudden and there is our waitress from the night before. If we're going to go all of a sudden there's a senator. It could be up the scale or down the scale in terms of hierarchy. How do we say we're all sort of equal in this?
Treat each other with courtesy and kindness.
Right. And that's sort of the same kind of thing that he is saying. If we all are one in Christ Jesus, but here are some things. So, a word for wives: treat your husbands with respect. This is appropriate in the Lord. And for husbands, you should treat your wives with love and not be bitter with them. Again, I'll reference Paul's letter to the Ephesians. If you want to do a little extra reading, chapter 5, starting at verse 21, he also is saying this kind of thing, but he expands on it a little more in depth. I may even start there next week if we go into this, because I realize we're sort of getting close to time. N.T. Wright and others have pointed out that actually the more controversial thing that Paul is saying in this is not wives respect your husbands, but husbands love your wives. Because those relationships may have been more contractual in that way. If you're the head of the household, you're used to just lording it over everybody. You're my kid, you're a piece of property, do what you want. You're my wife, you're essentially a piece of property, do what I tell you to. There is not a lot of love in that kind of thing. But now in Christ, that relationship is different. In particular, Paul often is talking about how the husband and wife relationship is to reflect the relationship between Christ, the bridegroom, and the church, who is the bride. And just as Christ loved the church, so the husband loves the bride. And that's a kind of sacrificial loving, that compassion and kindness that may not have been inherent in that relationship beforehand. Howard.
Just as a footnote, the Louisiana Civil Code has an article that says the husband is head and master of the community formed by the marriage of husband and wife.
Say that one more time. So this.
The Louisiana Civil Code has an article that declares that the husband is head and master of the community that is formed in the marriage of man and woman. And you can just imagine what happens in the household when the husband quotes that law to the wife.
Is that Napoleonic law?
Yeah, no, we don't know whether it came from France or Spain.
Right, and that's the trick when guidance becomes law. And that's sort of what I mean by proof testing. Let's take this system that I want to be able to prove is true, find it in the Bible, codify it, right, and then really cause a lot of havoc with all that's going on. That's right.
Rob, I know you're out of time, but maybe I could just submit a question for everybody to think about. And why is it?
Here, well, I'm going to bring the screen over to you. Bill's got a parting question for us to think about, which we'll try to remember to bring up next time.
This is a question for everybody. And that when you take a look at N.T. Wright's translation, he says, now a word for wives, you should treat your husbands with respect. Now that is entirely different than wives, submit yourself unto your husbands as it is in the Lord. And the definition of submit is to surrender oneself to the control or authority of another. I did some quick research and I found out that in 26 biblical translations that I looked at, nobody translated that passage like Wright did. They all said either submit or wives, you are subject to your husband. So the question is, why do you think N.T. Wright had such a radical retranslation of this passage in opposition to every other scholar who's ever looked at it?
That's right. John said maybe he lived in Louisiana for a while, and that's why. I will think if you look some of what N.T. Wright says in his commentary, he may give a little bit of an answer for that, but that's certainly worth considering and wondering, is he soft-selling this? And maybe he is, given the 21st century audience to whom he is writing. So next week, last class, we'll pick up here. We'll go to the end. Chapter 4 is rather short, and as you find in many letters, it's sort of perfunctory. Say hello to this person and that person and those kind of things. But one of the people that he talks about in all of that is a slave, or someone who's a letter to Philemon, who's referenced here, about his slave Onesimus. So it's an interesting context. And if you have a chance to read it, there's just one chapter in Philemon, the New Testament book of Philemon. Just read that chapter about slavery, because he's basically saying to Onesimus, go back and be a slave. Submit yourself. This is the way it is. And again, not overturning some of the social apple cart, but also in being a wife and being a child and whatever else, we're learning to submit to Christ, which I think is, again, an overarching theme in all the, we're practicing here our submission to Christ in heaven. Thank you. That was sort of a mouthful of everything. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks.
Thanks be to
And be
God.
careful in the traffic.
Thank you. This class is good.
Thank you. See you next time. Thanks for joining so much.
That's just a question.